She is Andrea Adelson, ESPN ACC reporter. Andrea, always great to have you on. I saw something on between the games that said you were voicing it on the coverage. I couldn't hear it because we were busy talking here, so I assume it was good. I have no idea what you were talking about, but I'm like, yeah, we've got her on in 10 minutes. That's great.
Well, thankfully it wasn't too in-depth on men's basketball. I'm going to admit that's not my wheelhouse. It was just, like how Charlotte has been a great place hosting the ACC tournament, but Charlotte hasn't really hosted it a whole lot. So that was basically the gist of the essay, and someone wrote it for me, which is very kind of them, and all I had to do was read words off a piece of paper, so made my job really easy.
There you go. Usually you're the one that's writing things, so a little role reversal for you. Yeah, you usually think of Charlotte hosting the ACC football title game, and Greensboro significantly more associated with the basketball side of things. You did write, I saw one basketball thing the other day. You wrote about Leonard Hamilton hanging it up here and called it a career. What do you make of kind of the last of the old guard here in the ACC, calling it a career here this week?
Yeah, it's been amazing watching all of the turnover across the conference in recent years. Obviously, it was three this year alone with Tony Bennett, who people just kind of forget. That was literally like only a few months ago.
Right.
I know it feels like years ago, but that was right before the season started. Of course, Jim Larinaga midseason, and now Leonard Hamilton. I've actually, of all the men's basketball coaches, I've gotten to know Leonard Hamilton the most, my proximity to Florida State, living here in Orlando. And he's just been so good for college basketball because he stands for all the right things, and he's been able to get the most out of just about every single team that he's coached, whether it was Oklahoma State, where he started his head coaching career, Miami back in the day, and obviously Florida State here over the last 23 years. And he's been an institution there, and he takes pride in the number of players he's been able to graduate and the impact he's had on so many lives. But you're right, it's a changing of the guard when you consider who's going to be the most senior, and I use that loosely in air quotes. Coach is Brad Brownell, which is just kind of like, what? How did we get here? And so I think a lot of that coaching turnover over the last few years has kind of brought the ACC to a point where it's been hard to get back to the history, tradition of what's made ACC basketball so good. When you turn over that many coaching legends over such a brief period of time, and obviously we've seen that at Syracuse as well. But the job Leonard did at Florida State was phenomenal, considering where the program was and the heights that he lifted it to. I'm going to miss him. I know that because you can have conversation with him about more than basketball. He really likes talking big picture and life and all of that. So, we'll see what happens tonight. If Florida State can extend his career at Florida State another game, but certainly the victory they had at home against SMU was a huge one to send him out the right way.
Yeah, they did it up real nice for him after that with his old college teammates and the whole thing. That was a pretty cool scene down there in Tallahassee on Saturday. As we got Andrea Adelson with us from ESPN, and the all great stuff to talk to you about, Andrea. But the real nuts and bolts is we got to know about all these lawsuits ending last week, and the ACC and Florida State, go figure, and Clemson, and it's all been resolved. Are people feeling good about this, or how are all involved parties feeling, I guess, now that this very long year and a half has come to an end?
Oh, man, it feels like longer than that when you consider all the threats before the lawsuit.
There were a lot of threats. There was a lot of saber rattling there.
Absolutely. I mean, it all started with expansion and everyone kind of considering what's their position going to be. I remember the Magnificent Seven being a storyline where 7 of the ACC schools were thinking about their future and what do they need to do. So I know the legal part has only been a year and a half, but quite frankly, it's been a slog because expansion is kind of set into motion. Well, what does this mean for us long term, right? Where do we stand, and where does the ACC stand? And is the ACC best positioned to be able to compete with the Big Ten and the SEC moving forward? And so when you look at what Jim Phillips was able to do to get everybody together behind a resolution, when you look at Florida State and Clemson agreeing to this resolution, I think there's something in it for everybody, quite frankly. And there may be those who are wondering, well, like, what's in it for schools that are giving up some of their television money just to make Florida State and Clemson happy, with the new brand initiative, which is essentially doing unequal revenue distribution based on what your viewership is going to be. And the answer to that is you get some stability here in the near term. And as I mentioned, I know the lawsuits had only been a year and a half, but there had been a cloud hanging over this conference since expansion in the Big Ten and the SEC, because there were a lot of people wondering, well, what's going to be next? And by next, I mean, what's the next domino going to fall? Is it going to be in the next year? And does that mean the ACC is going to be poached when it comes to the potential of super conferences, or the Big Ten and the SEC maybe wanting to add more teams? And so getting this resolution puts an end to that conversation, at least for the next couple of years. And so now you can kind of work together, game plan moving forward, to figure out some strategies about how are we going to try and do this before the next set of television contracts come up in 2030, which I think a lot of people have acknowledged and realized that that's going to be kind of the next pivot point in collegiate athletics. And folks inside the ACC are well aware of that and know that and understand that. And so the folks that I've talked to have basically said, giving up a little bit for some stability and to get rid of these question marks and get rid of the lawsuits is something they were willing to do so they can try and move forward together. So I don't think it's wrong to say that the ACC feels like they're a winner in this, and Florida State feels like they're a winner in this, and Clemson feels like they're a winner in this, because I think each got a little something of what they wanted.
Do you think, obviously it looks, clearly the goal is stability till, 2030, 2031, when obviously, the Big Ten TV contract is up, then everything probably goes haywire again, as it always seems to do. But I feel the haywire stuff always comes faster than we think it's going to. Do you think it's actually going to provide stability here for the next 5 or 6 years, or is that just a pipe dream in this day and age?
Well, it's a great question. I think one can only hope, right? I mean, I can only tell you that based on what I have been told. And that is what I have been told by multiple people inside the conference, right? Not just folks at Florida State, not just folks at Clemson. That seems to be the year that a lot of folks in the conference are talking about as a pivot point. Because, one thing that they'll all say is the Big Ten and the SEC just signed their television deals, right? I mean, they just started those, right? And so if there was going to be chaos in the next year, would Florida State and Clemson have tried to settle the lawsuit, right? If they thought in the next year we're going to have a chance to go out and go somewhere, maybe they would have tried to stay in the fight, right? So I think that's kind of one tell, is that they did settle so they can get a little bit of what they wanted out of this deal and have some of the stability before whatever happens in 2030 happens. So one can only hope. One can only go based on what folks are saying. But here's the thing, once 2030 gets here, even if it's beforehand, right, like you say, we don't even know what that iteration is going to look like. The next iteration of realignment could be wholly dependent on what happens with rev share and the House settlement and Congress getting involved, right, in all of this, and what judges may or may not determine. We're starting to see a movement with Olympic sports to have those housed under, U.S. national umbrellas, right? I mean, soccer looks like they may be headed that direction with men's soccer and USA soccer, right? Maybe that goes more to a European type model, right? And outside of the conferences. That's one thing that I know there are folks within conferences who have started to think about or talk about. I'm not saying those are the long-term plans, but I think it's important to understand that it may have looked one way here over the last 100 years, but it might look different because the NCAA is different now than it was the last time we went through this realignment with the SEC and the Big Ten. So we don't know what it's going to look like. We can only guess at this point, and the administrators as well are just using their best educated, informed opinions on what this may look like somewhere down the road. And so when people at Florida State and Clemson and within the ACC tell me 2030 is going to be that pivot point, I tend to believe them because it doesn't feel as if those other conferences, the SEC and the Big Ten, who hold all the cards right now, are in any rush to start changing the landscape, at least right now. Again, that's today on, I don't even know what today is, March 11th, 2025, right? When a year from now you can ask me the same question, it might be completely different. But at least for today, the folks within the conference believe that there is going to be some near-term stability.
Hey, we're 5 years to the day, Andrea, go figure, from when the NBA shut down from COVID.
Yeah.
So things can happen on days when you don't really expect it, is the lesson we learn time and time again. You mentioned rev share, and I think it's great in many ways, right? Like it'll be able to allow the schools to fund directly to the players, and it's a long time coming and all that. I think the thing, at least in my mind, that is getting missed a lot is that this is also a $20 million addition to all of these schools' budgets. Where are they getting all this money? I know Syracuse, they're trying out to raise $50 million over the next 3 years through fundraising. Is it coming from fundraising? Is it coming from TV? Where is this money coming from that is going to add to these budgets right now?
Yeah, that is the great question I think administrators have been asking for the last year is, all right, who's going to give me an extra $20.5 million, right? Because, when you look at the way athletic budgets are made, I mean, there's not an extra penny laying around, right? Your budget is $87 million. Let's just use that as a random example. You're using all that $87 million for the things that you have to do on a yearly basis, right? And so I think it's coming from a variety of different ways. Most of the schools that my colleague David Hale and I have talked to in the ACC are going to max out at that 20.5, or at least come very close to it.
You kind of have to, right, Andrea?
You have to, right? If you want to be competitive, you have to. And if you want to be competitive in football and men's basketball, you really have to. And that's been an issue, as you know, in the ACC, right? I mean, they've got to get men's basketball to a point where it's being funded in the same ways as what the SEC is doing right now. Let's be honest about it. And maybe some people took their eyes off the ball because there was a push to fund football, in bigger ways. Well, maybe basketball got lost a little bit. Can't have that anymore, right? So if most of the schools are going to be close to or at the $20.5 million fundraising efforts, you're absolutely right. That's happening at just about every single school in the country. There's going to be more schools that are offering institutional support. So basically the university itself is going to be giving money to the athletic department to help fund that. You're seeing schools like NC State that are fundraising in creative ways, like a donor now has his name in front of the athletic director position, right? I mean, Stanford has that too. NC State now has that with Boo Corrigan's job. They're also trying to sell naming rights to Carter Finley Stadium to a corporation. That's out for bid, right? So you've got schools trying to figure out, well, what are some different ways that we can do that? There are some schools that are raising student fees, and some of those student fees are going to go to help the athletic department. There's other athletic departments that are having to find ways to cut, not sports necessarily, but positions or telling some coaches, hey, we know that you want all of this stuff on your wish list. We can only give you 3 of your top 6 things, right? And the other 3 things that they're not going to get, that saves you a little bit of money there. So there is some cost trimming within athletic departments in terms of like what sports may or may not get, so that money can go into the greater revenue share pot. So every school is different, obviously, but the 2 main ways are the fundraising, as you mentioned, and increased institutional support.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting, I think, come July 1 when all the fiscal year starts for all these schools. Like, all right, what do, coaching staffs, support staffs look like? And right, not so much for football or men's basketball, but like who's still on the softball staff or who's hanging out with field hockey or soccer, right? Like that's where it feels like the trickle down might hit if you don't quite raise all that money.
Yeah, and already we've started to see student athletes for some sports like swim, for example, that have said, I'm not going to be on the swim team because we're cutting down our roster size, right? I mean, swim generally holds a large roster, and now people have to be on scholarship, right? So schools may be adding scholarships, but they're also decreasing roster sizes. And so there are going to be swimmers, and I'll just use that as one example, right, who may no longer be able to swim on a D1 level because they're trimming down on roster sizes. A friend of mine actually has a aspiring D1 rower, and she saw on Instagram last night of a swimmer, I'm not sure the school, in which she tearfully said, I don't have a scholarship. I've swam my whole life. I don't know what I'm going to do, a D1 swimmer. And she sent it to me. And is this happening, right? Because, of course, I'm the sports writer friend, and so I can, help her understand. And I'm like, this is a reality for some sports, not all, but some sports are going to be facing this, particularly the ones that have larger roster sizes. And I believe we already saw some of this happening in the SEC of student athletes being notified that they may not have a roster spot for next year. So that's certainly a concern, and it's unfortunate. It's really unfortunate because the rev share is designed to help student athletes, right? Student athletes have not gotten a piece of the money pie ever, right? So the intention is good, but the unintended consequence means there are going to be student athletes who worked their whole lives for an opportunity that may no longer have that opportunity, but because of the amount of money involved now with rev share, and most of that's going to be going to football, men's basketball, as you alluded to, what does that mean for everyone else? So, that part of it breaks my heart. Because you don't want to see any student athlete lose that chance because they have dreamed and worked their whole life for the opportunity. So hopefully it won't be as bad as what could be. We'll just have to see. That's another area. But one thing to remember here, this still hasn't been approved.
Right.
This is not still passed court. This is not an official thing yet. Yet schools are having to prepare for this reality July 1, and yet we don't have a ruling on this being the way that it's going to look. So still a lot out there to be determined on how this is going to shape up.
Yeah, I forget what Georgia said. They're cutting 75 to 100, I think, spots, but also adding similar amount of scholarships, so more scholars, right. fewer athletes. So if you're still there, it's good news, but if not as much. All right, Andrea, before we let you go, one more money question from the new thing in the ACC with the revenue distribution based on TV ratings and brand and all that. Obviously, that will be good for Clemson and Florida State in football. Do you have a sense, and this is going to be a rolling average, I think, over 5 years, how many schools in the league is this positive for? How many is it about the same, and how many is it negative? Do you have a sense of what the volume of breakdown is of where the money's going up and where the money's going down?
Yeah, it's a great question. And also men's basketball viewership is going to be involved in this, right? So I just saw Duke UNC the other night was 3 million viewers, right? So, and that was the highest rated in quite some time, regular season men's college basketball game. So those schools will stand to benefit, at least from a men's basketball perspective, right? It's a little tricky to answer that one right now because a lot of this is going to depend on your matchups, your non-conference scheduling, the network that you may end up on. So, for example, Georgia Tech last season was the number 1 rated ACC school and in football. And that probably is surprising to some people because you don't equate Georgia Tech with high television viewership, right? Well, the reason is they had a week 0 game, right, against Florida State on ABC that lots of people tuned in and watched. They had a marquee game against Miami at the end of the season that a lot of people tuned in and watched. And they had a Friday night game. They were the only game on, right, that went to, however, it was 6 overtimes against Georgia. That was on ABC. So, if you get those time slots, then you can almost automatically guarantee that you're going to have high viewership. It's just a function of being on ABC versus ESPN versus the ACC network, right? And so we have seen now a push from the ACC, for example, to have more Friday night games, right? Because they know they can have that exclusive window that they have to themselves, right? It became much harder for the ACC once the SEC came under the ESPN umbrella because a lot of those top-notch viewership posts go to the SEC. I mean, look at the ratings last year for what were the highest rated games. A lot of them were from SEC matchups that were on ABC. So in order to maybe counteract a little bit of that, the ACC's got a ton of Friday night games, all right? So if you're a school that maybe doesn't rate as highly in the regular season, I'd be raising my hand for those Friday night games. If it means, okay, I might get more viewers on a Friday night to watch us, right, as opposed to being like number 5 in line on a Saturday, right, in October. Let me get on a Friday night. Let me get on an odd, weeknight so that I can try and get us some money from a revenue share perspective, all right? So North Carolina, for example, I have a feeling North Carolina football is going to rate pretty well this year, and they're going to be on some prime slots. They've already got a week one. They've got a primetime slot. They've got a couple of Friday night games. So North Carolina, which has not finished in the top 5 in football ratings over the last 5 years, yeah, I have a feeling because of Bill Belichick, they're probably going to finish high. So a lot of it is dependent on not just the football product, if you're good, if you have a compelling storyline, but when you're playing and what slot that's going to be in. And so that's why it's a hard question to answer because it changes year to year. Yes, Florida State, Clemson, Miami are typically going to be among the more higher-rated schools, but that top 6 changes year to year based on a whole variety of different factors.
Yeah, and hey, part of this when Syracuse joined the ACC, they're like, well, we'll play Friday night every year, and they have done that, and go figure, they'll be hosting Bill Belichick and the Heels on Halloween Friday night this year, and it makes the crazy road schedule they have this year a little more palatable when you know that in theory people will watch the games, and at least you can make a little cash back off it. All right, Andrea, always great to chat. Really appreciate the time, and as you know, these stories never end, so I'm sure we'll check in again on it before too long, but thanks a lot.
I really hope this one's ended for now.
Yeah, I don't know when it's coming back, but as you know, it would be nice to take a little break from it from now. All right, Andrea, thanks as always.
Thank you.
All right, there she is, Andrea Adelson from ESPN. And yeah, we talked about it last year before the money part was involved, but like the TV assignments now and people in charge of that used to be like, oh, it's mildly annoying. We're on a different TV channel this week. Now it's like, oh, we accidentally crushed the softball budget because Syracuse ended up on the worst ACC network time slot. Where does the CW fit into all this? Questions galore. With that, we'll take a break. We'll get Tim in here, do a little 411, set the stage for Tim hosting pregame coming up shortly. After this, Syracuse Sports Talk and ESPN Radio.